My name is Finn, and I have spent the last 3 years working my fingers to the bone as a junior architect at Vance Associates. The firm is known for its sleek, modern skyscrapers, but behind the gloss lies a brutal work culture. My boss, Vance. Before we continues, please subscribe and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps this powerful, life-changing story reach the world. Is a man who values power over creativity and loyalty over talent. I grew up in a small town where hard work was the only currency we had, so I never complained about the 80-hour weeks or the fact that Mr. Vance often took credit for my best design concepts. I had a dream of seeing my own blueprints turned into steel and glass, and I was willing to pay my dues. However, the atmosphere in the office had shifted recently. Vance had brought in his nephew, Chad, as a senior lead, despite the fact that Chad could barely draw a straight line. I was tasked with doing all of Chad's work while he spent his days golfing and posting about his executive lifestyle on social media. I kept my head down, believing that my quality would eventually speak for itself. I had no idea that a trap was being set. The tension broke on a rainy Tuesday during the biggest team meeting of the year. All the senior partners were present, along with the entire design staff. We were discussing the Sterling Tower, a $200 million project that would define the city skyline. I had spent 6 months perfecting the structural integrity and the unique solar glass facade. It was my masterpiece. Mr. Vance stood at the head of the long mahogany table, looking as sharp as a razor in his Italian suit. He opened the presentation, but instead of showing my successful tests, he displayed a series of altered, corrupted files. I am deeply disappointed to announce that Finn has cost US weeks of progress. He boomed, his voice dripping with fake sorrow. He pointed to the screen where my calculations had been manipulated to look like they would lead to a structural collapse. This kind of incompetence is dangerous. Chad had to step in last night to redo the entire foundation plan just to save the account. The room went silent as everyone looked at me with pity or disgust. Chad sat there smirking, crossing his arms like a hero who had just saved the day from a villain. I tried to stand up, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. That's not true, Mr. Vance. Those aren't the files I submitted, I stammered, my voice trembling with a mixture of shock and anger. Mr. Vance slammed his hand on the table, the loud crack echoing like a gunshot through the quiet office. Silence. Your arrogance is only matched by your failure. You are a junior, Finn. You should be grateful we even let you touch a project of this magnitude. He turned to the partners, dismissing me as if I were a piece of trash on the floor. As of this moment, Finn is removed from all high-level projects. He will be relegated to archiving old blueprints in the basement until we decide if he has a future at this firm. He looked back at me, a cold, triumphant glint in his eyes. Now, get out of this meeting. You are an embarrassment to the Vance name. I walked out of that room with my head spinning, the laughter of Chad following me down the hallway. I felt completely shattered, my reputation ruined in front of everyone I respected. I spent the rest of the afternoon in the cramped, dusty basement, surrounded by smelly old papers and broken office chairs. Every time I tried to access the main server to prove that my files had been tampered with, I found my permissions were denied. Mr. Vance had locked me out completely. I realized that this wasn't just a disagreement. IT was a coordinated attack to ensure Chad got the promotion to junior partner. As I sat there in the darkness, a sense of cold calm finally settled over me. I remembered something Mr. Vance had forgotten in his haste to humiliate me. The Sterling Tower client, a brilliant but reclusive billionaire named Ilara, had insisted on a private communication channel directly with the primary architect. Because I had done all the actual work, my private work email was the only one registered in her secure system. Mr. Vance had taken my credit, but he hadn't taken my access. I pulled out my personal laptop and connected to the guest Wi-Fi. I knew I had to wait. If I acted too fast, he would see it coming. I needed the trap to be fully sprung before I pulled the lever. Later that night, I was sitting in my small apartment, staring at the rain streaking across the window. At exactly 9 p.m., my inbox pinged. It was the email that would change everything. I wasn't from Mr. Vance, but from Ilara herself. The subject line read, "Final review of Sterling Tower Foundation." She had attached the blueprints that Chad had submitted under his own name just an hour prior. I opened them and nearly choked on my water. Chad was so incompetent that he had simply copied and pasted an old mall design into the skyscraper template. It was a death trap. The wind loads were wrong, the weight distribution was impossible, and the cost estimates were inflated by $10 million. Ilara's email was short and deadly. "This design is an insult to my intelligence. If this is the best Vance and Associates can do, the contract is void at midnight." I realized that Mr. Vance hadn't even checked Chad's work. He was so blinded by nepotism that he had sent a garbage file to a woman known for her perfectionism. I had 3 hours until the deadline. It was time to reveal the truth. I immediately began typing a response to Ilara. I didn't complain or act like a victim. Instead, I attached my original, uncorrupted files, the ones that had been censored during the team meeting. I also included a screen recording I had secretly saved weeks ago, showing Chad logging into my terminal to download my work. I explained the situation clearly. The firm was compromised by nepotism, and the safety of her building was at risk. I hit send and held my breath. 10 minutes later, my phone vibrated. It was a calendar invite for an emergency Zoom meeting at 11 p.m. The invitees were Ilara, her legal team, the city building inspectors, and Mr. Vance. I smiled to myself. Mr. Vance probably thought this was a celebration call to finalize the deal. He had no idea that the gala he was preparing for was actually his own funeral. I dressed in my best suit, sat at my desk, and waited for the clock to strike 11. The basement junior architect was about to become the chief prosecutor in the largest corporate scandal in the city's history. When the Zoom call started, Mr. Vance was on screen in a silk robe, holding a glass of expensive scotch. He looked radiant and arrogant. "Ilara, my dear, I assume you are calling to congratulate Chad on his brilliant revisions," he purred, not noticing me sitting in the corner of the grid. The silence from Ilara was deafening. She was sitting in a dark office, her face as hard as granite. "Vance," she said, her voice colder than ice. "You sent me a design that would collapse under its own weight. You also tried to hide the fact that your firm is run by a thief." Mr. Vance's smile froze, and the glass in his hand trembled. "I don't understand," Chad assured me. Ilara interrupted him by sharing her screen. She displayed my original files side by side with Chad's disaster. "This is Finn's work," she stated, pointing to the perfect calculations. "And this is the trash your nephew submitted. Why was Finn relegated to the basement today, Vance? And why did your nephew log into Finn's computer at 2 a.m. last night?" Mr. Vance turned pale, looking like he was about to faint. "There must be a misunderstanding," Mr. Vance stammered, his arrogance evaporating into pure panic. I finally turned on my microphone. "There is no misunderstanding, sir," I said calmly. "You humiliated me in front of the entire firm to protect Chad's lies. You told the partners I was incompetent so you could steal the credit for the Sterling Tower. But the data doesn't lie." Ilara nodded, her eyes fixed on Mr. Vance with disgust. "The city inspectors on this call have already flagged your firm for safety violations based on Chad's submission. As of this moment, I am terminating all contracts with Vance and Associates. Furthermore, my legal team will be filing a lawsuit for corporate fraud and breach of ethics." Mr. Vance began to plead, but Ilara had already moved the cursor to the end meeting button. "Oh, and Vance," she added, "I'm starting my own design firm next week. And Finn is going to be the CEO. Good night." The screen went black, leaving Mr. Vance staring at his own ruined reflection. I sat in the silence of my apartment, feeling the full weight of justice. The next morning, The firm was in total chaos. The news of Ilara's withdrawal had leaked, and the senior partners were calling for Mr. Vance's resignation. I walked into the office at 9 a.m., not to the basement, but directly to the main floor. I saw Chad trying to sneak out the back door with a box of his belongings, but he was intercepted by 2 police officers who were there to seize the servers. I walked past him without saying a word. Mr. Vance was in his office, surrounded by lawyers, looking 10 years older than he had the day before. He saw me through the glass walls, and for a moment, our eyes locked. There was no anger in my gaze, only the calm satisfaction of a man who had finally cleared the debris from his path. The firm was crumbling, but I was standing on solid ground. I went to my desk, gathered my personal items, and prepared to start the new chapter Ilara had promised. The humiliation in the meeting had been the catalyst for my freedom. Within a week, Ilara had secured a massive loft space in the heart of the district. We named the firm Sterling Architecture. She gave me full creative control and a staff of the most talented designers who had fled from Mr. Vance's sinking ship. The Sterling Tower was no longer just a project. IT was a symbol of integrity. Meanwhile, Mr. Vance was facing a multi-million-dollar settlement and the permanent loss of his architectural license. Chad was deep in legal trouble for identity theft and corporate espionage. They had tried to bury me in the basement, but they forgot that I was the one who knew how to build the foundation. As I stood on the balcony of our new office, overlooking the site where the tower would soon rise, I realized that the truth is like steel. IT might get hot under pressure, but it never breaks. I was no longer a junior architect waiting for a chance. I was the master of my own destiny, and the view from the top was even better than I had imagined. Over the next few months, the reputation of Sterling Architecture grew at an unprecedented rate. Clients who had previously been afraid to speak out against Mr. Vance came to us with stories of his bullying and theft. I listened to every single one of them, promising a new standard of transparency. We weren't just building structures, we were rebuilding the trust of an entire industry. Ilara was a brilliant partner, providing the financial backing and the strategic vision that allowed my designs to flourish. We hired junior architects who had been overlooked elsewhere, creating a culture where the best idea always won, regardless of the name on the paycheck. I often thought back to that rainy Tuesday meeting. I realized that if Mr. Vance hadn't humiliated me, I might have stayed at his firm for another 10 years, slowly withering away in his shadow. His cruelty had been the wind beneath my wings. Justice wasn't just about his ruin. IT was about our ascent. Every beam placed at the Sterling Tower site was a testament to the fact that you cannot build a legacy on a foundation of lies. Meanwhile, the legal battle against Vance and Associates reached a fever pitch. The senior partners, desperate to distance themselves from Mr. Vance, filed their own lawsuits against him for breach of fiduciary duty. They revealed years of embezzlement and discrimination that went far beyond my case. It turned out that Chad wasn't the only nephew he had tried to force into a leadership role. The firm was systemically rotten. As the evidence mounted, Mr. Vance tried to sell his remaining assets and flee the country, but the court issued an immediate freeze on all his accounts. He was reduced to staying in a small rental apartment, the very type of building he used to mock. I saw a photo of him in the local news. He looked broken, devoid of the polished arrogance that had once defined him. I felt a strange sense of pity, but it was quickly replaced by the memory of the hundreds of architects whose careers he had stifled. The fall was hard, but it was necessary to clear the air. The industry was finally breathing again. One evening, Ilara and I were reviewing the progress of the tower's construction. The foundation was finally complete, anchored deep into the bedrock. "You know, Finn," she said, looking out over the city skyline. "People like Vance think that power is something you take. They don't realize that true power is something you earn through excellence." I nodded, feeling the truth of her words. I had spent so long worried about the titles and the hierarchy, but at the end of the day, all that mattered was the quality of the work. We discussed our next project, a sustainable housing development for low-income families. It was a departure from the glittering skyscrapers, but it was something I was passionate about. I wanted to use my success to give back to the kind of community I came from. Mr. Vance would have never allowed such a low-profit venture, but at Sterling Architecture, we had the freedom to define our own success. The world was wide open, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the heights. The basement was a distant memory. The construction of the Sterling Tower moved along with incredible precision. Unlike the chaos at Vance Associates, every person on the team felt valued and heard. We used advanced robotics and AI to ensure that every calculation was double-checked, preventing the kind of human error that Chad had tried to hide. As the tower rose, floor by floor, I became a beacon of hope for the entire city. People stopped on the street to watch the cranes lift the solar glass panels into place. IT wasn't just a building, IT was a statement. Meanwhile, Mr. Vance had finally reached a plea deal with the prosecutors. He confessed to the fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence, but the condition was the permanent loss of his firm and all his professional standing. The office he had built was liquidated to pay the victims of his theft. I bought his old drafting table at the auction. I didn't need it, but I wanted it as a reminder that the tools of the trade belong to those who actually know how to use them. The ghosts of the past were finally being laid to rest. As the final beam was set to be lifted to the top of the tower, we held a small ceremony for the construction crew and the design team. I stood on the top floor, looking down at the city. Below, the view was spectacular, but the sense of accomplishment was even greater. Ilara joined me, handing me a bottle of champagne. "We did it, Finn," she said, her eyes shining. I thought about my parents back in my small town, and how proud they would be to see this. I realized that success isn't just about revenge, it's about the beauty of creating something that lasts. I had taken the ashes of my humiliation and turned them into a landmark. Mr. Vance had tried to erase me, but he had only succeeded in making me permanent. The tower was a physical manifestation of my resilience. As the beam was bolted into place, I felt a profound sense of closure. The battle was over, and we had won in the most meaningful way possible. The sky was the limit, and I was finally ready to touch it. The grand opening of the Sterling Tower was the event of the season. Every major news outlet was there, and the city gala was filled with the most influential people in the world. I stood in the grand lobby, watching the sunset reflect off the marble walls. It was the perfect culmination of 3 years of struggle. Ilara gave a speech, thanking the entire team and specifically highlighting my journey. "There are those who try to dim the light of others to make themselves brighter," she said, looking directly at the camera. "But true brilliance cannot be hidden. Finn is the heart of this building, and he is the future of this city." I felt a surge of emotion as the crowd applauded. I looked out at the faces, remembering the sneers and the pity from that team meeting so long ago. They were gone now, replaced by genuine respect. The tower was no longer just steel and glass. IT was a vindication. I was no longer the junior architect in the basement. I was the visionary who had changed the skyline. The story of my humiliation had become a legend of triumph. After the gala, I took a moment to walk through the tower alone. The silence of the building was peaceful, a contrast to the noise of the crowd below. I went to the observation deck and looked out at the city lights. I felt a sense of total contentment. I had not only reclaimed my career, but I had also built something that would benefit the community for generations. The sustainable housing project we had started was already under construction, and we were planning more developments that prioritized social impact over profit margins. Mr. Vance had disappeared from the public eye, his name a cautionary tale in architecture schools. I had learned that the best revenge is indeed living well, but even better is doing good. The power I had gained wasn't a weapon, IT was a tool. I looked up at the stars, feeling a connection to the universe that I had never felt before. The journey had been long and painful, but every step had led me to this moment of perfect balance. I was finally home. A few months later, I received a letter in the mail with no return address. I opened it and found a single sheet of paper with the words, "I'm sorry," written in shaky handwriting. I recognized the script. I was Mr. Vance. He was in prison now, serving his time for the fraud. I sat with the letter for a long time, feeling a mixture of emotions. Part of me wanted to be angry, to remind him of the night I spent in the basement crying, but the anger was gone. I realized that he was a man who had become a victim of his own greed, lost in a world of his own creation. I didn't reply to the letter. I didn't need his apology to feel whole. I had already forgiven the situation, not for him, but for myself. I placed the letter in the drawer of my new drafting table, a final piece of the puzzle slotting into place. The cycle of bitterness was broken. I had moved on, and his regret was no longer my burden to carry. I was free. Sterling architecture continued to flourish, becoming one of the most sought-after firms in the world. We won numerous awards for design excellence and ethical leadership. I was invited to speak at universities and conferences, sharing my story with young architects who were struggling in toxic environments. I told them to trust their data, to protect their work, and to never let anyone dim their light. I became a mentor to many, ensuring that the next generation wouldn't have to go through the humiliation I endured. Ilara and I remained close partners, our bond strengthened by the battle we had fought together. We built a legacy that wasn't just about buildings, but about the people who lived and worked in them. The city skyline was changing, and I was proud to be a part of it. The basement was a distant memory, a faded scar that only served to remind me of my own strength. I was a master architect, a leader, and a man of integrity. One day, I visited the old site of Vance Associates. The building had been repurposed into a community center and art gallery. I walked through the familiar hallways, feeling a strange sense of nostalgia. The room where the meeting took place was now a bright, open studio for young artists. I saw a group of kids working on a mural, their faces filled with excitement and hope. It was the perfect transformation. The space that had once been filled with fear and arrogance was now filled with creativity and joy. I realized that nothing is permanent, and even the darkest places can be brought into the light. I left the building with a smile on my face, feeling the full circle of my journey. The humiliation had been the seed, the struggle had been the growth, and the success was the harvest. I was standing on the shoulders of my own resilience, ready for whatever the future held. The story of Finn was no longer about a victim. It was about a hero. As the years passed, the Sterling Tower became an iconic part of the city's identity. It was featured in movies and photography books, celebrated for its innovative design and sustainability. I often took my own children to the observation deck, telling them the story of how it was built. I didn't hide the truth about Mr. Vance, but I focused on the importance of honesty and hard work. I wanted them to know that success without integrity is hollow. They looked up at the tower with awe, seeing the legacy of their father. I felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that I had left the world a better place than I found it. The basement was gone, replaced by a height I had never dreamed possible. I was no longer defined by the humiliation of one night, but by the excellence of a lifetime. The view from the top was indeed spectacular, but the view from the heart was even better. I was finally, truly, content. I eventually retired from active design, passing the reins of sterling architecture to a talented young woman who had started as an intern. She embodied all the values we had built the firm upon. I spent my days in my garden, surrounded by the beauty of nature, reflecting on the long road I had traveled. I had seen the rise and fall of many, but I had always stayed true to my bedrock. Ilara had passed away a few years prior, leaving a legacy of philanthropy that continued to change lives. I missed her dearly, but I knew her spirit was still in every building we had created. The world was different now, more focused on sustainability and fairness, and I liked to think we had played a small part in that shift. I looked at my drafting tools, now sitting in a glass case, a symbol of a career well lived. The story was complete, and the ending was even better than I had written in my dreams. On the 25th anniversary of the tower's completion, the city held a special ceremony in my honor. I stood on the stage in front of the building, looking out at the thousands of people who had gathered. I spoke about the importance of holding on to the truth, even when it feels like the entire world is against you. I shared the story of the client's email that night, and how one single moment of integrity can change the course of history. The applause was thunderous, but the real reward was the sense of inner calm I felt. I had faced the darkness and emerged into the light. I had taken the ashes of my humiliation and turned them into a monument. As I looked up at the glittering solar glass of the tower, I realized that the truth is the only thing that truly lasts. I was Finn, the architect of my own destiny, and I had built a world I was proud to live in. Later that evening, I sat alone on the balcony of my home, looking out at the city lights. The tower was illuminated in the distance, a constant reminder of the power of resilience. I felt a sense of total closure. The journey had been long, filled with challenges and triumphs, but every single moment had been necessary. I had learned that humiliation is not an end, but a beginning, if you have the courage to fight for the truth. I had gone from the basement to the CO office, from a victim to a visionary. I had built a legacy of integrity that would outlast me. I took a deep breath of the cool night air, feeling the full weight of my success. IT wasn't about the money or the awards. IT was about the fact that I had stayed true to myself. The view from the top was spectacular, but the view from the end was peaceful. I was ready for the final chapter. As I closed my eyes that night, I had a vision of my father walking through the vines of our old farm. He looked at me with pride, nodding his head in approval. I realized that the values he had taught me were the foundation of everything I had achieved. I had carried the soil of my small town into the heart of the big city, and I had built something beautiful from it. The client's email had been the catalyst, but the strength had always been inside me. I was Finn, the man who would not be broken. I had faced the humiliation, I had revealed the truth, and I had built a world of excellence. The story was over, but the legacy would live on. I drifted off to sleep, a smile on my face, knowing that the tower was standing tall, anchored deep in the bedrock of the truth. The world was bright, and I was finally, truly at peace. My legacy was secure, and the future was infinite. The passing of Ilara a few years later was the hardest foundation I ever had to stabilize. She wasn't just a business partner, she was the architect of my second chance. After her funeral, I walked through the empty halls of sterling architecture, feeling the weight of the silence. I realized that the best way to honor her wasn't through tears, but through growth. I established the Ilara Vance Mentorship Program, specifically targeting young designers from underprivileged backgrounds who were being stifled by corporate tyrants. I wanted to ensure that no other Finn would ever have to rot in a basement while a Chad took the credit. We opened offices in 3 different countries, spreading the philosophy of integrity-based design. The firm was no longer just a company, IT was a global movement. Every new hire was given a copy of that original client email from Ilara, framed as a reminder that a single second of truth can outweigh a decade of deception. We were building more than skyscrapers, we were building a new standard for human dignity in the workplace. The view from the executive suite was no longer about looking down on others, but about lifting them up to the level they deserved. I often wondered what became of the land where Vance and Associates once stood. One afternoon, I drove to the old neighborhood and found that the community center we had funded was brimming with life. I sat on a bench outside and watched a young man, perhaps 20 years old, sketching the Sterling Tower in his notebook. He had no idea who I was. I asked him what he liked about the building. "IT looks like it's breathing," he said, pointing to the solar glass fins. "My teacher told me the guy who designed it was almost fired because he wouldn't lie about the safety specs. It makes me feel like I don't have to be a cheater to be successful." I felt a lump in my throat as I realized the story had gone beyond the boardrooms and into the hearts of the next generation. The humiliation I endured was no longer a personal scar. IT was a public beacon. I gave the young man my business card and told him to call me when he finished school. Justice isn't just about the fall of the wicked. It is the uplifting of the innocent. The circle was completely unbroken. By the time I reached my 70th birthday, Sterling Architecture had completed over 100 major projects around the globe. I decided it was finally time to permanently step away from the drafting table. My retirement gala was held on the top floor of the Sterling Tower, the very place where my journey had truly begun. As I looked out at the hundreds of architects I had trained, I saw a map of a better world. There were no Chads in this room, only hardworking men and women who valued the truth. I received a telegram that morning from a former warden at the prison where Mr. Vance had served his time. He had passed away in obscurity a year prior. There were no news reports, no statues, and no legacy left behind. He had built his life on sand, and the tide had finally taken him. I felt no triumph, only a deep sense of validation. The architect who builds with lies eventually crushes himself under the weight of his own roof. I turned my back on the ghosts and faced the bright lights of the party. In the quiet years of my retirement, I returned to the small town where I was born. I bought the old farmstead where my father had taught me the value of a straight line and a solid foundation. I spent my days repairing the old stone walls and teaching the local kids how to read blueprints. One evening, I found an old box in the attic containing my very first design, a birdhouse I had built when I was 7. Even then, I had reinforced the base with extra nails. I laughed, realizing that my integrity had always been my core material. The world had changed so much, but the physics of truth remained the same. I sat on the porch as the fireflies began to dance, feeling a connection to every building I had ever touched. They were all still standing, not because they were the tallest, but because they were the most honest. I was Finn, the boy from the farm who refused to be buried in the basement. I had built a life that no one could tear down, and the ground beneath me was finally, truly at rest. As the final chapter of my life approaches, I look at the skyline one last time through the window of my study. The Sterling Tower still glows in the distance, a permanent part of the horizon. I recently completed my memoirs, titling the book The Analog Kill Switch. It is a guide for anyone who feels overlooked, undervalued, or humiliated by the powerful. I want them to know that the email is always coming, provided you have the courage to stay at your post. The truth is a slow build, but it is an unstoppable one. I have reached the end of my draft, and there are no errors left to correct. The word count of my life is exactly where it needs to be. I am ready to close the ledger, knowing that every beam is secure and every deed is signed. The view from the end is not just peaceful, it is perfect. I am Finn, the master architect, and my work here is finished. I drift into a deep, calm sleep, leaving behind a world that is a little more upright because I chose not to bend.